We are in an early model JK with a 6.0 L96 6L80, a combination that we've done dozens of times before, guys. So we're not going to talk a whole lot about the powertrain. What I want to talk about is transfer cases. I did a video on transfer cases a while back, but I still get a lot of questions, and more than questions, requests for transfer case gear ratios, which I don't think are appropriate. So we're going to talk about that. We'll also talk a little bit about a twin stick versus a single stick transfer case. Probably the least on the chain of transfer cases, or the center diff as some call it, would be the all-wheel drive transfer case. The all-wheel drive transfer case distributes power front and rear. Usually there's some kind of center differential inside of them. Some of them can be locked up, some of them can't. But essentially you always have the same final drive ratio. You can't go into a low range. A lot of SUVs have all-wheel drive. They're pretty easy to use. There is no selection for low range. So essentially the center diff distributes power to the front and to the rear. If you start losing traction in snow or mud, it will transfer power where it needs to go to get traction. In the early days, it was a lot less sophisticated. Today, of course, they've got all sorts of electronics controlling it. And not only can you control the front to rear distribution of power, but you can also control the left and right by using active braking. BLD, brake locking differentials, the Wrangler JK has been using since the beginning, and it actually works. I've tested it. It's not as good as a selectable locker, but it does work. Land Rover has been using this technology for years to distribute power to each individual wheel, and it's becoming the norm. There's pluses and minuses to it. You can overheat your brake system in some situations, and of course not having a low range means you're greatly restricting your off-road performance. So we're not going to talk about a lot of the early transfer cases, the old Borg Warners, the new process, because there's just too many of them. We're just going to talk about the basic options you have in a JK, or at least the ones that we offer. So having a low range is huge, because here you have this giant earth-roaming SUV that weighs 5, 6, 7,000 pounds, and you're going up and down steep inclines. So having that low range means that you can apply the engine power to the output a lot more accurately than if you were in high range. Torque multiplication in an automatic transmission combined with the low range gear ratio in a transfer case means you can now go over obstacles with ease that you might struggle with if you were in a high range. Manual transmissions, of course, benefit from two-speed transfer cases. However, they can be a little more tricky off-road. You really got to know what you're doing with a manual transmission to get the most out of it off-road. Automatics, especially the higher gear, 6, 8, and 10 speeds, make it easier off-road because they put you in the gear you need to be in. How many times have you been off-road with a V6 and you find that you're revving the motor too much and you're not going as fast as you want, and then maybe it'll upshift and now it bogs the engine down? Well, a high gear transmission can overcome that and make off-roading a lot easier for you. So the JK has always had a manual 2-speed transfer case. What does that mean? Well, manual means it has a lever that you grab and move it between the positions. Most of the transfer cases today are automatic, so they either have a push button or some kind of computer control to select what range you want. Sometimes there's a dial like on the Range Rover and some of the new Jeeps, and you can select whatever range you want, and then solenoids and vacuum actuators and whatever put you in that range. It's so comprehensive today. When you turn a knob into a certain position, it can actually raise or lower the vehicle, set up the gear ratio, the range that you want, change the engine performance output parameters. Now, I'm not a big fan of all that. I'd rather just keep it simple. And like the English say, when you grab the lever and hear that clunk and lock the center diff, that's about as much traction as you're going to get. If you take a Rubicon and lock the front axle, lock the rear axle, and then lock the center diff, that's as much traction as you're going to get. All four wheels are basically locked together, and you're not going to get any more. And then you say, well, why would you want some of these higher end transfer cases like Atlases? And we're going to talk about that. And essentially what they do is they give you more options, more modes. So let's talk about the 241J. J standing for Jeep. The 241 was also manufactured for other manufacturers like Chevrolet, so there is a 241C. And there's a lot of interchangeability, but some of the stuff is different. Starting with the early JK, like the one I'm in right now, the 241J had 4 modes. It had 2-wheel drive high, 4-wheel drive high, neutral, and then 4-wheel drive low. In each one of these modes, the ESP, or electronic stability program, would change its parameters. So in 4-wheel drive low, it would disable pretty much all of ESP. It did not disable brake locking differentials like we talked about, because if you're stuck in sand or snow, you have to give it throttle And when the computer sensed, because remember the JK has 4 wheel speed sensors, so it knows what each wheel is doing. It also has a steering angle sensor, so it knows which way you want to go. And when it combines all this together, it sees a wheel skidding or spinning. It can then brake the opposite wheel, which then transfers the power to the one that's losing traction. And this actually works really good. I used to have a 2008 JKU Sport, and not having locking differentials, going up some hills, I would start spinning a wheel, and a lot of guys would just let off at that point. But really, if you just stayed in the throttle lightly, you don't want to dig a hole, but eventually the operating system would then apply power to the opposite brake, and you would then get more traction, and in most cases I would end up going up the hill. Would I prefer to have a selectable locker? Of course, but obviously the cost and the complexity of a selectable locker is a lot more than just adding some electronics to the braking system. So the 241J is a manual 2-speed gearbox. That means it has 2 ratios. Obviously it has 1-to-1, which means it's straight through. So when you don't engage 4-wheel drive low, it comes in the input shaft and essentially goes right out the output shaft. When you enter 4-wheel drive low, it disengages the input shaft from the main shaft, and then it drives a counter shaft, and that's done through a chain in the 241J, and that's important, remember that. So now it has different size gears or cogs or sprockets that lower the ratio. Now a standard 241J non-Rubicon is 2.72 to 1. A Rubicon is 4 to 1. So the front planetary in a Rubicon transfer case is much larger, and if you look at the transfer case, you will notice that the diameter is a lot larger up front where it bolts up to the transfer case adapter. That is the easy way to identify a Rubicon transfer case. A lot of guys will call me and say, hey, I just bought a transfer case and I thought it was a Rubicon and it says 241J on it, or MP4J or whatever, but really don't worry about that. Tags can be changed and tags are not accurate sometimes. Just look at the size of the front planetary. If it's larger than the transfer case main body, then you probably have a Rubicon transfer case. Now we have to talk about the 241J because there's so much confusion with the different variants, and we're only talking about the JK right now. There was a 241 in the TJ, but it's different than the JK. It did not have the slip yoke eliminator and did not delete the vehicle speed sensor like the JK did, so they're not interchangeable. So if we look at a standard non-Rubicon 241J from 2007 to 2011, they're all pretty much the same. They might have a few little brackets and such that are different, but they're all the same. They have the same input, they have the same output, and they are interchangeable. In 2012, when Chrysler went to the WA580 transmission, they put this weird female output shaft on the transmission and then put a male input on the transfer case. So starting in 2012, automatic JK 241Js became a different animal. They had a male input into the transfer case, and they are not interchangeable with pretty much anything else. And I don't know of any adapters. Well, I mean, Advanced Adapters makes some adapters to go to the Atlas and such, but as far as engine conversions go, we don't support that male input 241J 2.72 to 1. Now the same holds true for the 241 OR. Now the Rubicon transfer case could be called the OR for off-road, HD for heavy duty. There's all sorts of names for it. Chrysler actually has different names for it. They changed manufacturers from NP to MP, so it can be confusing. So it's best to identify the transfer case based on its attributes. Look at the front planetary. Is it large or is it small? If it's large, it's a Rubicon 4 to 1. If it's small, it's a non-Rubicon 2.72 to 1. Look at the input. If the input is female, it has the standard small JK input, then it is a 2007 to 11 automatic or manual, and it is a 2012 and up manual. And yes, the 2007 to 2018 JK 241 are pretty much all interchangeable because the manual transmission, the NGS 370, did not change the input. So you can use that transfer case in your swap. The only one you can't use is the 2012 and up Rubicon and standard 241Js that came with the WA580. So as a rule of thumb, just say if it had an automatic 5-speed in it, you can't use that transfer case in your swap. And guys, just about every week I get a guy that tries to put a late model automatic transfer case in their swap, or just put it in their early JK and it doesn't work, and they call me and they ask why. That's why. Because the WA580 changed the 241J. Now previously I said that the 241J was a chain-driven transfer case. And that's important because the operation of the transfer case is very efficient, very quiet. The chain is not only quiet, but it transfers the power to the countershaft with very little friction. So now we're able to use a ATF, or a very low viscosity oil. So now this transfer case is low friction, lower heat, and it does have an oil pump in the rear of the transfer case that pumps the oil throughout the transfer case. So if you're towing, now always read your owner's manual, but in general, if you have a transfer case with a pump on the output shaft, so if the output shaft is turning, it's lubricating the transfer case, you can usually tow with it. Now there's always a caveat with that, so read your owner's manual. But the bottom line is the 241J is quiet, low friction, but it's not necessarily very strong. The weakest part of the 241J is the input. It's small. It has the same size input shaft as the old 4L60 Turbo 350. Now those engines are running 350 horsepower usually max. So it was okay with that. But when you go to a heavy duty truck or a 7,000 pound JK with a V8, you're just gonna break that input and output. And we've done it on the 4L60s. So fortunately the 241 was manufactured for Chevrolet. And the 241C that was put in the heavy duty trucks had a large 32 spline input that was very strong, and it could handle 450 horsepower. So we put that input into our transfer case kit. Now it's not a direct bolt in. Don't just go out and buy a gear and try to put it in your 241J. It's not going to fit. In the old days, the 241C inputs were modified. Today, the gears are pretty much just made from scratch. So with the Motec input gear, the 241J is good for 400 to 500 horsepower. We've run them behind the LT 6.2s often with very little issue. So now we have a transfer case good for over 400 horsepower. It's quiet, it's low friction, and it's low heat. And remember I said heat, because that's going to come into play later on. For all you guys that want to run the Rubicon transfer case, this starts getting a little more complicated. You can run the Rubicon transfer case in a swap, but you're going to be stuck with that small input gear, which basically means you're going to shred that input gear with anything more than about 350 to 400 horsepower. Secondly, the gear ratio in the Rubicon is all wrong for general off-roading. Now we have to talk about what is general off-roading versus crawling. So if we look at an early JK, they have about a 3-to-1 first gear in the transmission. It's actually not quite 3-to-1, but it's close. And we're just going to generalize it at 3-to-1 because when they went to the WA580, that was pretty close to 3-to-1 too. And we have to compare that with the GM transmissions. The 6L80, 8L90, and 10L80 are 4-to-1 up on their first gears. So they're significantly lower than the Chrysler transmissions. So if you were to take the Rubicon transfer case at 4-to-1 and put it behind a 6L80 at 4-to-1, now you're at 16-to-1. You can see how much lower you are than a stock Rubicon. And that's great if you just want to crawl, if you want to lock it in first gear and get out of the vehicle and make a video while it crawls along at half a mile an hour. But it also makes it extremely difficult to brake. It makes it pretty much useless for general off-roading, mud, sand, snow, and 4-low, especially running higher speed trails. The LSJK with the 6L80 can run 40 miles an hour in four-wheel drive low. But if you have a 16-to-1 low ratio, you're not going to be doing that. At least you're not going to be doing that comfortably. So too many guys get their head stuck, and I've got to have the lowest ratio transfer case that I can get. I've done 5-to-1 transfer cases with 6L80s. That's 20-to-1 low ratio. And I've been going down hills, and I just skid down the hill if I keep it in first gear because it's virtually locked up those wheels. And then when it comes time to brake, you're pretty much not going to brake comfortably unless you have some kind of hydro boost, so you end up putting it in neutral when you come to a stop. It's really not the ideal situation. Therefore, the 241J non-Rubicon 2.72 makes the perfect combination, because when you combine that 2.72 with the 4-to-1 output of the 6L80, you're at 11 and change on the low ratio, close to 12-to-1, which is the same as a stock Rubicon. Now add to that, you've got a V8 with, in general, 400 foot-pounds of torque. You have 2 more firing pulses per revolution for compression braking and for acceleration. So you have the perfect combination. You have a transfer case that's low friction, low heat, low noise, good for over 400 horsepower, low cost. You can pick up these 241Js for $300 all day long. They wheel excellent off-road. You got almost a 12-to-1 low ratio. It's just the ideal combination. So if you have a Rubicon, my advice is sell the Rubicon transfer case. They go for $1,000 and up on the aftermarket. Buy a 241J for $300. Buy the Motec transfer case adapter kit. It comes with an input gear, it comes with a clocking ring, and that clocking ring depends on whether you have a 6L80, 10L80, 8L90, etc. But we will set you up with the right one. It comes with the transmission mount, hardware, etc. Now before we move into the Atlas, we're going to talk about the modes. Now my personal 09 JK back in the day, because really this stuff wasn't available, I used a 241C. It was a driver's side drop and it bolted right in. Now if you look at a 241C, the modes are the same, but the shift pattern is different. In a JK, you all know that all the way forward is 2 high, right behind that's 4 high, behind that's neutral, and then all the way back is 4 low. In the 241C, all the way forward is 4 high, then you go 1 back, that's 2 high, then you have neutral and 4 low. So it's similar, but it's not the same. And I was putting those in the early swaps, and I had to build a special transfer case range sensor, and that's something I want to mention right now. The transfer case range sensor is a little plunger sensor that sits on top of your transfer case, 2-wire. A lot of guys don't know what that is. But basically, as that goes up and down, it changes the resistance value that the computer reads, or the TIPM. It actually goes with the TIPM reads, and that tells the TIPM what position the transfer case is in, and then that's broadcast over the network, and that tells ESP, like the ABS module, what to do, what to disable and what not to disable. Because again, there's different ESP modes for every transfer case position. So it didn't take long that we got the 241J supported. We got the bigger input so that it could go behind the 6L80. And the 6L80 and 8L90 run the large output shaft like the 4L80. Very strong.